the reason why I stepped up a moment ago actually turns out to be an object lesson for the session we're about to have on juicy grammar. The reason is that I went to go refresh my iced coffee situation, and I won't tell you now. This will be a little bit of a cliffhanger. You'll see in about 10 minutes why that's a reference to a very specific concept in this presentation. I'm going to go dive right into sharing my screen with us. We have a topic that is juicy indeed, to wit, grammar, the juicy joys of grammar. How many people here enjoy grammar in some form or another? Whatever you mean by that. You like to nerd out about it sometimes. I see hands up. I see people affirming that in the chat. So do I. I've spent a lot of time learning different things about the grammars of different languages. Like all of you, I've spent, well, I shouldn't speak for everyone. Like many of us, I've spent a lot of time teaching or attempting to teach grammar in various ways. And much of my academic background is in linguistics, and specifically second language acquisition, where researchers study the impact of teaching grammar, and especially teaching grammar explicitly, but other ways as well, on a person's ability to actually use a language in the wild. And we'll investigate some of the prominent results there. So this is the joys of grammar, and we are going to enjoy it in our own way. I'm going to have some great news for you all. I'm going to have some practical advice, and I might even have some challenging questions for us. So wherever each person is here in your thinking about this topic or in your practice on this, hopefully there'll be something for everyone. Here's the official agenda. We're going to address ever so briefly the topic of guilt. And it's interesting, when you think about language teaching, the area where we're in one direction or the other. Oh, I teach too much grammar and I feel guilty about that. I teach not enough grammar. I feel guilty about that. We're going to get that right out of the way, because guilt does not lead to good results when it comes to teaching or when it comes to discussions among teachers. So we're going to address that briefly. That'll be the first thing. We're going to talk about, just so that we're on the same page, what do we and what do people in general even mean when they say grammar? Because people mean different things by it. And if we can be aware of what do they actually mean in this situation, or what does this research result mean when it says grammar, then we can avoid accidentally interpreting either what someone else does or what some research says in a way that that person didn't even mean. So we'll talk about what some of those options are. We will look then at a couple maybe alternative lenses, maybe some ways you've looked at grammar before or conceived of grammar before, maybe some new ones. And built into that, but we'll also give it its own good sizable chunk of this presentation, because we're all here to become more effective teachers. We'll talk about some practical strategies for the classroom. And then I'll leave you with a couple of closing thoughts and a challenge. So let's dive in. First, guilt, bad. There are situations where feeling guilty is maybe an appropriate part of new action or something like that. When it comes to teaching and teaching practices, and in this case, stuff related to grammar, I don't want anyone to, based on what happens in your teaching life outside of here, or based on what I say here, to feel guilty. We have all different kinds of reasons why we teach the way we do, or why we've tried things that we've tried. That includes the ways we ourselves have been taught or have learned or have been trained. It includes lots of things that we've tried. It includes slightly different goals that many of us may have. Regardless of what those are, it's fine for us to be where we are and then see. I mean, you wouldn't be at a conference like this if you weren't the kind of person who was curious about some new ideas or maybe some ways of tweaking your practice. So we'll look at things that way, not in the format of X is bad, Y is good, do it this way, don't do it that way, etc. Something we will talk about that I've found is a really helpful way of reframing conversations about teaching practices away from this works and this doesn't work, or this is good and this is bad, is instead to think about, what are my goals? And if that's my goal, what are good uses of time? I'll say it again. What are my goals, or what are the outcomes I'm hoping for? And if those are my outcomes, then what are good uses of my limited time with students? And what are good uses of our limited cognitive capacity, ours and students? So we'll get into that. But more specifically, I want to point out that you may need to teach certain things or do things in a certain way in order to keep your job. That's totally fine. I'll never judge anybody for keeping food on the table. And if that means teaching, tweaking slightly how you would maybe prefer to in one direction or the other, I'll never judge you for that. Related to that, you got to follow your conscience. This is true in life in general and in teaching in general. Ultimately, some of your decisions about how you teach in general and how you address grammar, they might come from kind of cognitive or intellectual ways of that you have learned things or have made decisions. But ultimately, my guess is that you're going to want to follow your conscience. In other words, you want to teach in a way that you actually believe in. And that is also okay. You can't expect ourselves or our colleagues to go against our conscience, whether that's in the direction of teaching more grammar or in the direction of teaching less grammar. So I just want to kind of throw all that out there, acknowledge it as kind of a baseline or background for anything that we talk about here. And I put it this way and use such strong words as guilt, not because I'm trying to create heaviness or because I'm about to get into super heavy discussions. I just know from almost 20 years of working in classrooms and working with teachers, and from before that, working on research, that somehow, for whatever reasons, the topic of grammar can be one where people make each other feel guilty, or they leave a conversation or an interaction feeling guilty, and I want to acknowledge that, but also rise above it. Everyone take a deep breath with me and just let it out. That's as much for myself as for you all. So let's dive into some lenses. The lenses are coming up after we talk about what does grammar even mean. Remember, I was saying, and here I'll go into detail, that people mean different things when they say the word grammar. None of these is right or wrong. It's just the word grammar, like lots of other words, has multiple meanings. So sometimes people mean a kind of a prescription of how people should talk in order to be perceived as a certain way, how people should talk in order to express a certain thing. And that has a very interesting background. Some of that comes from actual ancient opinions about language in general. But it's tied up especially with a really, really, really strong focus. Depending on what you read, you might even say an obsession with extreme accuracy, kind of perfection and accuracy. That comes again partly from ancient ideas about the role of language and the power of language. It also has a really quirky, fascinating connection with an old meaning of the word grammar, which is that way back in the day, talking in medieval English, the Anglo-Saxon, and then Middle English, the word grammar had another meaning, which was magic. That's right, magic, as in doing spells. If you're familiar with the term for a spell book that is a grimoire, that's the same word as grammar. And the idea there is that apparently, I don't have experience with it myself, but apparently when you're saying magic spells, you got to be super, super accurate because how you say it could cause a certain thing. And in many cultures, that belief exists more generally, even when you're not doing magic. You've got to say stuff exactly right, or else you might cause some unintended effect. And in many ways, that's actually the origin of kind of an emphasis on precision in language. That's one meaning. By the way, here's an example of the word grammar being used to refer to magic, a spell of grammar. It's an old spelling with an extra Y there, but it's the same word. One common meaning of grammar, what people mean when they say that, is not necessarily the language itself, but an actual organized system. As in, go in, you take all the parts of a language that you can detect, and you organize them into parts and into rules that you kind of perceive based on how you see the language used. And that comes out in lots and lots of books. These kinds of books still exist, but they were especially common in the 18th and 19th centuries. Books with titles like A Grammar of Sanskrit, A Grammar of Latin, A Grammar of English, even. And what that means is taking like all the parts of speech, taking all kinds of different sentence forms and different things like that, and laying them out in a way that that makes sense systematically to whoever's writing the book. One very important thing to note on this is anything that is written in these books isn't necessarily something that's true about the language itself, let alone about what's going on in the brains of people who use the language. It's just an external description. Kind of like if you describe a house from the outside, you can make accurate statements about what the house looks like from the outside, but you're not actually demonstrating anything about how a house works, all the different systems in a house and how it's put together. Doesn't mean it's useless. It's just important to keep in mind that it's not built up from how language exists in the brain. It's from kind of an outside perspective on all the data that you can get when you read lots of sentences in the language. Third thing that people often mean is not just rules themselves, but specifically terminology that's created to talk about those rules. And here's what I mean. You can picture this applies for Italian, Spanish, Latin, for example. You could tell a learner, hey, if you're talking about yourself, put o at the end of the action word. Quiero, amo, tengo, or in Latin, also amo, habeo, teneo, you name it. And I could say, hey, if you're talking about yourself, put that o at the end of the word. Or I could use terminology that was invented in order for scientists to talk about that feature and say what technically is attempted to communicate the exact same thing. The first person singular present active indicative of regular verbs is formed by adding o to the stem. And the reason why I give this example here where it says terminology for these parts and rules is that even though both these sentences are intended to communicate the exact same thing and are intended to bring about the exact same outcome in the learner, there are people who would say that in the second version, you've taught the grammar, but in the first version, you haven't actually taught the grammar because you haven't used that terminology. I'm not making that an official declaration. I'm just pointing out that that's sometimes one use of the term grammar. Last but not least, there's one more use of the term grammar that I want to focus on. And this is the term that modern linguists this is the meaning of the word grammar that modern linguists almost always have in mind when they are talking about the word grammar. Not always, but almost always. I'll mention some exceptions. And that is, it's simply a way of describing how people actually talk, especially how people from native speaking communities in the language actually talk. And we are going to be paying special attention in the rest of this presentation to this idea of when we look at texts written by native speakers, when we watch video or listen to things written by native speakers, how do those communities tend to talk or write? Keeping in mind that there's a lot of diversity even among native speakers of a language. So we're going to focus especially on how people actually talk and how people actually write and how we can help students move in that direction. And we'll also talk, starting with a little bit of research and then moving in a practical direction on, hey, what's the role of meanings 2 and 3 here? The idea of kind of a formal system for how parts of the language fit together and some terminology for that. What might be the role of that in helping students speak and write more like number 4, how speakers of the language, communities that use the language actually talk. Another deep breath. That was the bit about various meanings of grammar and how we're going to, and meanings that we're going to keep in mind as we go forward. Let's dive into, let me actually make this point at first. First, when one has these 4 meanings, potential meanings of grammar in mind, anyone who's a language teacher in some form or another teaches grammar. There's no such thing as not teaching grammar if grammar is understood as how people talk. In other words, even if I never say anything explicit about grammar, about endings or anything like that, if I say things in the target language and students understand at least some of it, then some teaching grammar is going on in that students' brains are starting to make connections between the form of what they heard and the meaning of it. So a good way to establish some common ground, if you're someone who maybe doesn't use a lot of grammatical terminology and someone says to you, oh, you don't teach grammar, or do you teach grammar? The answer is, of course I do. And I do it by speaking to students in a comprehensible way, providing them with comprehensible text, and so on. So all of us, in some form or another, if we ever say anything in the target language to our students that they understand, we're teaching grammar in some form or another. And for the rest of the presentation, we'll get into more detailed ways of viewing and enacting that. Okay, so we're going to look at two different lenses here that are going to help us make sense of the practical strategies that we'll then spend the bulk of our time on. I'm going to, because, hey, you see it's kind of faded in the background there, but that is actually this very same mug. And this first lens is something that linguists and psychologists actually refer to as the interface. And I'll tell you exactly what I mean by it. The interface debate or the interface question addresses a really pressing question for language teachers and learners, which is how much does explicit knowledge about a language impact a person's ability to actually use the language? So for example, when I showed that sentence earlier, the first person singular present active indicative of irregular verbs ends in O, or is formed by adding O to the stem. If, let's say, a person knows that sentence perfectly, that's explicit knowledge about the language. How much does perfect knowledge of that actually cause a person in real time to be able to use that correctly when they speak? That's the question that the interface is attempting to answer. And there's basically three main views. And this is an analogy that I've invented, which is you picture that you have a mug of coffee. This really is the exact same mug from when I made this picture, or rather made a video from which these are screenshots. And picture that the coffee in the mug is a person's actual proficiency in the language. In other words, their actual ability, if they're thrown in a situation, to understand the language, produce the language, if they're watching a video, to understand what's going on, if they're reading a story, to understand what's happening in the story in real time. That's their proficiency in the language. The cream that you see here on the right represents knowledge about the language, facts about the language. These could be things like conjugation charts or noun declensions. They could be statements, such as the one I shared before about first person present active indicative is formed like this, and so on. These things that you can learn about the language. There are three basic conclusions to consider about, okay, how much can that kind of information, that explicit knowledge about language, actually affect my ability or a learner's ability to use the language? And so we'll go into these really quickly with analogies. The first is maybe it can affect it a lot, right? Maybe if I take that explicit knowledge and I pour it into the brain that has this developing language ability, maybe it mixes right in and truly becomes part of the substance, okay? And the reason why I hopped up real quick was to add some cream to this so that it would be super tasty, and it went right through, okay? There's what we call a strong interface between the cream and the coffee in this version. The opposite extreme is maybe you have, oops, wrong direction, is maybe you have this coffee representing the brain of someone who's beginning to grow in the language and the system of language production and comprehension that they have. And you take that cream of explicit language knowledge and you can pour it onto there, but there's like an airtight barrier, non-porous barrier. It's not getting through. It might be in a container, but it lives separately, lives in kind of a separate compartment. It's there, but in its own compartment. And of course, there's the in-between version, which is maybe gets poured through a filter and most of it kind of backs up in the filter and stays there, and some drips through. In the concrete version of this, some creamer drips through to affect the coffee a bit. In the metaphor that we're talking about, maybe some of that linguistic knowledge, most of it kind of stays separate, floating around in some other part of the brain, but some of it seeps through and manages to actually influence a person's ability to use the language in real time. So these are kind of the three main positions. Basically, you can tell it's kind of like two extremes and then an in-between position. These are called respectively. There's the idea that there's no interface. In other words, the two things don't really communicate each other. They're two completely separate containers or vectors in the brain. On the far end, that there's a strong interface. They totally intermingle those two types of knowledge and ability. In the middle, that there is a weak interface. Let's to add a hint of participation here. Which of these positions? So this question has been studied a ton through all kinds of studies where people were taught in some explicit manner and then tested on their proficiency and so on for decades. This question has been looked at. Where do you think most researchers, most linguists land on this question? In other words, is there a really strong interface between linguistic knowledge and linguistic ability? Is there no interface, or is there a weak interface? Go ahead and throw out some of your thoughts, some of your guesses. I'm going to see if I can open this chat. Okay, I see people starting to say weak. Makes a lot of sense. We're intelligent folks. First of all, I probably wouldn't be sharing this if it weren't some kind of nuanced thing. And second of all, we probably, from our own experience, have a take on this. And someone makes the good point that it could kind of depend on kind of the learner's temperament, maybe their age, maybe how proficient they are already, and so on. So there could definitely be variation from learner to learner. Well, I'm happy to report that you are absolutely right. The weak interface is the most common position by far. By far, you'll be very hard pressed to find a researcher who says that explicit knowledge about a language makes a big difference in a person's ability to actually speak. You could list on one hand by name those researchers that are out there. So Sue points out some students have a need for it, and I like thinking of it that way. That need, we may talk about this later, that need is mostly emotional, right? It's mostly for comfort or to feel like you're learning something that you can kind of get right. It's not necessarily in the first place because they know their brain works a certain way or something like that. But that can actually be a really good reason. I think it's actually one of the best reasons to give students sometimes that explicit linguistic information is if it just helps a person feel like they're learning something and feel more at ease or more comforted. A lot of times it can be, for me too, it can be like intellectually super satisfying to learn something like that. So I want to make a last point about this interface before going to the second lens, which is I want to make sure it's extra clear that it's not just that the strong and no interface positions are extremes and the weak interface is right in the middle. It's more kind of concentrated this way. And what I mean is, again, on this question, how much does explicit linguistic knowledge impact proficiency? A little bit, so the weak interface, it's not in the center. Like people don't think it's about 50-50. The vast majority of people think it's like almost none, almost no positive effect. There is research, by the way, showing that in some cases, learning an explicit linguistic rule can actually make you worse because you generalize wrong or start second guessing yourself or things like that instead of just going with what you've heard or trusting yourself. But I want to make sure that people get that it's right over. That most people's view is not that it's in the middle. It's that it's kind of over on this end towards none, but you can affect it a little bit. The last thing I'll say about this is that even the folks who say that the explicit grammar knowledge can have a big impact, big positive impact, they will, if you read these articles, and I have a bibliography for you at the end of this slideshow, which is going to be shared with everybody in case you're the kind of person who likes to follow up on that. When you read the sentences in articles, research articles that are written that support, we did this explicit grammar teaching and then students did really well on the test for this, they will say, but we found that this was only true for some of the students on some of the grammar points. In other words, even the most extreme researchers on the side of, explicit grammar knowledge can make a big difference, hedge their bets a lot and say, you know what, it's, not always, you can't count on it, depends on the situation, depends on the learner, it depends on the feature of the language. And there's a favorite phrase of mine, a really cool phrase that appears in a lot of research articles about teaching aspects of a language, which is that researchers use the term about a lot of grammar features of a language. being, quote, impervious to instruction. They're resistant. No matter how hard you try to teach that thing, the brain somehow resists that knowledge until it's simply gotten a lot of input on that. Anyway, we can nerd out about those kinds of phrases later on. Let's proceed to the next lens, just quickly as a source of, hey, how can Justin say, has he read like every single article? How does he know that this is the main opinion among researchers? That is my impression. However, two researchers, Hannah and Finneran, set out to review hundreds and hundreds of pieces of research and by different researchers and categorize all those researchers according to their position on here. And they're the ones that concluded that there's a huge preponderance of people holding to this idea that it can make a little bit of a difference, but not much. And on that note, you can probably guess this already. This quote, explicit linguistic knowledge is necessary for reaching a high level of proficiency, has not been said by any linguist. I don't think there's one out there who thinks it's necessary. There are people out there who say, it might help in certain situations. But if you're someone who's kind of concerned about your students' growing proficiency and you're wondering, do they have enough explicit linguistic knowledge, or is a lack of explicit knowledge keeping them from advancing in proficiency, you can rest assured that if you were to talk to a researcher on second language acquisition, this would say, if your students are struggling to progress in proficiency, that could be for lots of reasons, but not knowing grammar well enough is probably not one of them. Interesting to think about. Okay, let's check out the next lens. And this lens okay, we're doing great for time. This is perfect. We'll address this briefly, and that'll leave us plenty of time for all the practical strategies. The second lens I'm calling for short FONF, and I'll tell you what I mean by that. I'm able to glance a little bit here in the chat. And Jacqueline, it's a great point about how you sequence some of these items can make a big difference in retention as well. We're actually going to get to that in some of the points that we look at later on. Thanks for bringing that up. So FONF is short for something. It's short for the question of what's sometimes called focus on forms, that's the F on F, focus on forms, or its alternative, which we'll see in a second. What focus on forms, now we're shifting from more theoretical to more practical. So this now is an actual category of teaching strategies called focus on forms that involves first teaching, like at the beginning of the unit, for example, teaching how to construct a certain tense. Like what are the endings, or you take the stem and you add these endings, or how to make the plural of a noun if you start with a singular version, and so on. That's called focus on forms because a lot of times it's based on what are different forms of the same word. So that's one family of teaching. A lot of textbooks from before the 1980s are like this. They take that approach in some sense. By the way, the ones that take that approach don't take it based on any kind of research. They take it because that format of textbook was based on those books that I showed beforehand, the covers of, that say things like A Grammar of Sanskrit and so on, which weren't meant to be textbooks. They were just like meant to be kind of scientific charts about language, but people took those, added exercises and readings to those, and made it a textbook. So that it was based on kind of handiness, not based on any research that would be a good way to learn. But a lot of books and curricula work that way. You teach some grammar concept, then you practice it either by producing it in various sentences or by seeing it in various readings, and then you move on. So that's called a focus on forms. On the other end is something called focus on meaning, where you don't lead with that. In fact, you never really get to charts and things like that and teaching them. You focus on real-time communication and just kind of clarifying what you mean, maybe through a quick English translation, through pictures, through gestures. Maybe there's a story with lots of illustrations and so on. So this is like 100%, you're just focused on what's going on in a story or in a situation without calling attention to specific aspects of the language like endings. And then, as you can imagine, just like before, there's an in-between version, which is very confusingly, I have beef with the guy whose terminology took off on this, but it's very confusingly called focus on form, which makes it sound a lot like focus on forms. But what focus on form is actually a focus on meaning. In other words, you start just by trying to communicate. Maybe that's a story or a movie with lots of illustrations. Maybe that's doing total physical response with lots of gestures. Maybe that's using images to clarify meaning of a word. But then when there's kind of a breakdown in meaning, in other words, when the pictures aren't clear enough, or when the physical actions aren't clear enough, you bring in a quick explanation explaining, oh, well, the reason why I said tienes instead of tengo is because I was talking to a you person. So that quick explanation layered onto a focus on meaning. That again is focused on form. And I'll save you the guessing this time because it aligns a lot with what we talked about beforehand. Just like the weak interface position is by far the most common one, the focus on form position is by far the most supported one in research on language learning and teaching. In other words, stay resolutely focused on meaningful interactions and layer on some short explanations to make sure that people are understanding and catching on along the way. And so for the rest of this session, we're going to talk about what are some ways that in our language classes we can do this focus on form approach. And yes, Jennifer, incidental grammar instructions, it's maybe I wouldn't say it's another term for the same thing, but it's basically the same thing. So incidental meaning as it comes up or falls in. And yeah, BOSIS does a lot of that as well. BOSIS, depending on which title you're using, there's some additional things as well. So for the rest of this time, we're going to talk about what are some really specific, super hands-on. I'm going to give you exact scripts, like you can say this sentence in your class to your students to help make this focus on form happen. In other words, in the context of communication that leads towards proficiency, what are some ways that we can layer on kind of just the right amount of explicit grammar instruction in memorable ways that help students progress and feel comfortable, feel like they know what's going on in the language, feel like they can express themselves if they need to, and actually can express themselves in the way that they're trying to. So let's dive into those. Come on. I'm going to skip some of these quotes, but you can find them in your, when you look through the slides later on. Let's dive into those practical strategies. I'm dividing them into two main ones, and that may not seem like a lot, but each one has actually lots of ways you can do them and lots of subtypes. The first type, I'll share after I take a next swig of my high interface coffee. The first one, which ties right into what Jennifer was saying about incidental grammar, is often called pop-up grammar. And we're going to talk about lots of different ways that this can look. So under the general heading or rubric of pop-up grammar, in other words, it's grammar that you're moving along in communication, or you're teaching, or students are communicating, and then poof, this grammar lesson pops up just at the right time, worded in a way that's really handy for students. That's what we're going to focus on, a bunch of different ways that you can do that, ways that are more or less demanding on students, depending on their level and what you're going for. And I think it's cute that I found this great picture of a toaster with toast popping up, just like the grammar in these examples. So what is pop-up grammar? Pop-up grammar is simply a short, in context. What I mean by in context is maybe people are reading a story and there's a snag in understanding, and so you explain right then that bit of grammar. Or maybe a student's trying to express themselves and they run into a situation where they're not able to express what they're trying to express, or maybe they accidentally express something different than what they meant, and you help them with how they can express the thing they actually meant. That's what I mean by in context. I'll say in a moment more concretely what I mean by short and what I mean by explanation. So pop-up grammar is a short, in context or in the moment explanation of something about a language, as an information about how language works, as opposed to just continuing pressing on with whatever a story is or whatever the interaction is. And so let me give us a bunch of pointers about this. Another way of thinking of this is like when or why would you do pop-up grammar? Because technically with every single word, there'd be something to explain if you wanted to pause and explain something, right? So when we do it when there is a specific break in the moment where there's a specific breakdown in communication. Someone wasn't able to understand the story, or someone wasn't able to express what they meant. Or sometimes, and this ties into what someone was saying about students wanting those explanations sometimes, there's a breakdown in confidence. Like a student's like, I think I understood this, but I'm actually not sure why. and I'd love to know for sure next time. That's an example of kind of a breakdown in confidence that might warrant pop-up grammar. So let's get in some details of how this looks. A very common way, common kind of sequence, and again, I'll go into even more detail and specific wordings in a moment, but a common way this comes up is maybe a student asks the question about what something means or why. Then the teacher will explain that real quick, and then the teacher will ask another question to confirm that it's been understood. That's one way it can look. Maybe, as we'll see, maybe none of the students have asked a question, but the teacher really wants students to notice a certain thing. So the teacher will ask a question to kind of prompt or figure out, do we understand what's going on in language here? Then give an explanation and then ask a confirmation question. So let me give you some really specific classroom scenarios of when or why this would come up and what we as teachers can say to help students in those scenarios. We have two versions of this, and I kind of hinted at this, but we can do it as kind of a reactive or responsive, or in other words, we notice a breakdown in communication or a failed, that sounds really harsh, but a failed attempt to communicate. In other words, you accidentally communicated something else or failed to communicate what you're trying to communicate. And so we pause and we clarify that. That's kind of reactive. The proactive or prompting students, that's when maybe we're detecting or we're hoping that students have now begun to notice and understand whatever the thing is. And so we're going to actually prompt the pop-up situation ourselves, even though there hasn't necessarily been a breakdown in the communication. I recognize that in a way that gets away from kind of the core ethos of pop-up grammar, but it's okay. No guilt. So let's look at some very specific examples. I personally especially love doing this. You can do it in other contexts as well, but I especially love talking about grammar with some explicitness in the context of something that's written, whether it's a sentence that's written on the board or whether it's a story or text that everyone has in front of them or it's projected on the board. Why? Because those written words, unlike sound waves, are there to stay. We can continuously observe them. We can mark them up. If we just heard someone say something orally, and then we're going to talk about like the form of what they said or the grammar of what they said, the longer we talk, the longer those sound waves that people heard have dissipated, and it's not really present necessarily in people's minds anymore. It becomes much more abstract. And for those of us who may have ended up in this job because our brains are really good at maintaining kind of language and balance or keeping in mind something we just heard someone say, given that not all and maybe not most of our students have that as well, especially in a language that they don't already know, it can be all the more reason to make sure that if we want to explain something that came from an oral interaction, we really quick write that sentence down or an example sentence, or that we focus, like in the examples I'm going to give, we focus our explanation on a text that's in front of students. And I especially like to do this in the form of what's sometimes called contrastive grammar. In other words, why is the form of the word this here, but now the word's spelled like this over here? For instance, this is a French example. I'll do languages in a couple different examples in a couple different languages to spread the wealth. Let's say that students are used to the word fait, meaning do or does, or make or makes, fait, from faire in French. They're used to that because it's a super common verb. And now, maybe for the first time, maybe not for the first time, but it hasn't come up much, maybe now the form faisait comes up, which is underlined here. And a student might ask the question, wait a minute, faisait, I thought it was fait. That would be the reactive version, right? A student asks that question. Remember that sequence? Question, explanation, follow-up question. Maybe the student asks the question, Monsieur Bailey, professeur, why is it faisait? Or what does faisait mean? Is it related to fait in any way? For example, I can say, yes, very good. What does fait mean again? Student or students say does or makes. Say, that's right. Faisait means did or was doing. So if fait ses devoirs means does his homework or is doing his homework, what does faisait ses devoirs mean, as in this example? And the answer I'm going for is, oh, was doing. He was doing his homework, okay? I can still later on, either in the same class period or another time, I can still point out the charts, maybe point out the index in the back of a book if that's something people use, that's fine. But I've led with the situation where A, it's meaning focused, it's a story, and B, the explanation happened right when students actually needed it. And guess when is a great time to teach someone something? When they actually need it, or when they actually want to know it. And so that's one of many advantages to this pop-up approach. I'll give a German example really quick, maybe either from a vocab list or from previous teaching. Maybe students are used to the combination of words der Computer, the computer, der Computer, der Computer, der Computer. They've heard that a bunch of times. But then they're reading this email to grandma, liebe Oma. They're reading this email to grandma, and they see repeatedly den Computer instead of der Computer. If you're not a German speaker and you do or don't track with this example, no problem. But a student might ask, hey, den Computer, we learned der Computer, or on the quiz, it was der Computer, or we were saying before, der Computer, why is it den Computer here? I can give that, remember, short, specific, in-context explanation and say, yeah, great observation. And I'll often use these exact words, say, great observation. In German, and actually in a lot of other languages too, the form of the article will change depending on what that noun is doing in the sentence. So sometimes you'll see der, sometimes you'll see den. Now, depending on the level of students, I could actually just leave it at that, and I'll say, don't worry, over time, you're going to start seeing the difference between the two situations, and we'll talk about it more then, and we can move on. So I can say, oh, den is just another word for der, and we can move on. That's kind of one level of explanation. I've acknowledged that student's uncertainty, praised them for noticing it, given them just enough of an explanation that we can move on, and that's that. Maybe I feel the students are more ready, or maybe that student wants to dig deeper and I can tell, or they say so, and I can say, yeah. So in this case, it switches to den, and this will happen with other words as well. It switches to den because something's happening to the computer instead of the computer doing something. In fancy grammar speak, we say the computer is the direct object. Someone is buying a computer as opposed to the computer doing something. And the second is bringing the computer. So it's den Computer because something's happening to the computer. And then I always add, especially early on, don't worry. I know it's very different from how English works, but it's so common in German. You're going to see it all the time. And I'll keep pointing it out until you get the hang of it. That kind of makes sense as a script and there's some actual words that we can use with students. Again, that doesn't mean that I cannot, either to satisfy my own conscience or to satisfy students' curiosity or to satisfy a curricular requirement, show students, give students a chart with all the different forms of the article, in this case, the masculine definite article in German. Doesn't mean I can't do that, but it does mean that I've kept the focus as much as possible on meaning and communication, because that's what language is for, and because linguists are telling us that's more likely to be successful. I'll give you a couple more ways that I sometimes ask these questions, more ways to bring up this kind of thinking and these kind of lessons and have them land. So I could also, another way that I could phrase that is like say, what's the difference between fait and faisait? And when I ask that question, I'm always referring to meaning. I'm not saying, the question isn't what are the different letters in those two words. It's what's the difference in what someone's trying to communicate if they say fait versus if they say faisait. Another way of drawing these things out of students, which calls on students a bit more now, because now they have to actually come up with words in the target language to answer the question. I could say, let's say that faisait, we're reading this and says faisait ses devoirs, which means he was doing his homework. Class, what would it mean if it said fait ses devoirs instead? And students call out, it means he is doing his homework or he does do his homework. Yes, very nice class. And I can ask some more rapid fire questions like that. So they haven't had to produce a target language word themselves yet, but I've given them another target language word in a different form that's not written here and asked them to say what that would mean. Then I can crank it up one more notch if I want and say, how could we make it mean he is doing instead, right? It says faisait ses devoirs, he was doing. I can ask the class, how could we make it mean he is doing instead? And now I am asking them to come up with that French form, which would be fait in this case, right? And that confirms students' answers, maybe ask some more questions as well. By the way, something I often do is when either noting or reviewing a form like this, in this case, faisait, imparfait, imperfect for the non-French users here. If I want to kind of rapid fire get the hang of that, say, hey, if faisait means he was doing, what does aimer mean? Okay, he was loving, or he was loving, or he loved in the past tense, and to get kind of a rapid fire, a bunch of those. What does il pouvait mean? He was able, and so on. So lots of rapid fire examples like that to point out all those similarities. And last but not least, another one of the proactive or prompting versions of this that I like to do, once students have gotten a lot of oral input, maybe we've done some PQA, some personalized question and answers about a topic with students, maybe we've talked about a picture for a while in the target language, targeting certain forms of the language, maybe we've read a text that contains certain forms of the language, and students have maybe seen, maybe heard, maybe even used several times a certain form of the language, but they haven't gotten to satisfy their curiosity about why does it work that way or why is it like that. And so I will give them an opportunity. Usually it's at the end of a certain phase of instruction. That could fall at the end of a class period, but it also could be just the end of a certain activity or task. And say, hey, class, now that you've heard the language a lot over the course of this class period, now that we've read this text, I've seen in your eyes, and some of you even ask questions like, what's the deal? Why is it spelled, this word spelled this way in French? Or why does this word appear in different forms? Go ahead and take a minute with the person next to you and just point out as many things as you can that you see on this projected text or on your paper, as many things you can about how French seems to work. Pretend you're like teaching someone who's not in this class or asking questions about how the actual language works. How do the endings work? How does the spelling work? How does the punctuation work? Anything, I'm not fishing, just anything you want to notice or are curious about. And I'll let students come up with some things like that. I might also have them do it individually first to collect some of their observations, and then we'll discuss as a class. And again, it could be whatever they bring up. Why is the punctuation like this instead of how it is in English? And German, a lot of times is, hey, well, how come all the nouns are capitalized at the beginning? Or it could be something that's a more grammatical question. And then I'll take a couple of those comments. I'll either do a quick pop-up grammar explanation to satisfy the students, or I'll just praise them for that observation and say, hey, great observation. That's something that starting next week, we're going to be seeing much more, different options like that. So that's kind of an open-ended, all-encompassing, whatever may come up way of prompting pop-up grammar. Let me give you, because I promised I would, one other approach that's also kind of inductive, as in starting with instances of the language and then succeeding that with observations about the language and lessons about the language. Well, let me actually recap real quick pop-up grammar. You'll see this on the slides as well. But basically, when you're doing pop-up grammar, you want to address a specific situation, whether it's a breakdown in meaning or breakdown in communication in a specific sentence. You want to address the meaning. What does it mean and why? And in that process, I avoid, and I recommend that you avoid, explicit grammar terminology, not because it's evil, but because it doesn't actually communicate anything about meaning to most students. So just say, this means he was doing such and such, as opposed to saying, this means it's the imperfect tense. You can teach that separately if you want, but I would say that's a layer on top of. And last but not least, keep it quick. When I say quick, I mean like 10 seconds. It's very tempting because we know so much about language and we're so interested in it to do kind of the full explanation, explain the whole system right off the bat. That's not something that we need to do in order to help students actually understand what's going on and start to internalize it and move on. We can later, and I sometimes do this, I'll have like on a certain Friday, we'll have like Linguistics Friday, and we'll talk more about the systems and we'll co-construct maybe a declension chart or a conjugation chart using words whose meaning students have already come to terms with, come to understand through interaction in class. So I want to share with you ever so briefly this second idea, which is called concept attainment. This is another way of making sense of major grammatical points or categories. This was developed originally not for language, but for other topics. But if you're a person who really likes your students to think about in terms of kind of grammatical categories, or maybe your curriculum requires you to, this can be a more interesting way of doing it with students than maybe some traditional grammar presentations are, and a way that kind of sticks a little more. And basically how it works, I'm going to mostly refer you to a specific blog post that includes an instructional video tying this to language, but I'll give you a bit of an overview here. Basically, what it consists of is you take a bunch of examples, many of which reflect whatever the grammar feature is that you're talking about, or that you want students to start noticing it, and many of which don't. And at the beginning, you just give those examples one at a time. You give the example, and if it has the feature, it shows the feature of the language that you're talking about, you say, this is a yes. Then you show another example, maybe it has that feature of language as well. You say, this is a yes, and you put it in the yes column. I'll make this even more clear in a moment. Then you say another section, another sentence, and it doesn't have that grammar in it. You say, this is a no. And you have maybe 3, 4, 5 examples in each column. And then students can see that, and then students try to come up with more items for each column. And you help them understand, like, that's right, that would be a yes. That's right, that would be a no. And then you proceed. So let me tell you the exact, that's kind of the initial background. Let me give you the specific, some more specific steps on this. And I'll make sure that you have this link to the blog post and the video as well, in case this is something you want to try. There's some information here about why even do this. It has to do with students co-constructing knowledge and so on, and thinking inductively, in other words, drawing conclusions from actual language examples. In this case, we won't go over this slide in great detail because I want to give you a concrete example before giving us some closing exhortations. So here's a concrete example drawn from art history instead of language in order to make clear what we're talking about. So you can see a bunch of paintings here. They're small, but there are here, I think, 10 paintings. And I would show, if I were an art history teacher, I would show these one at a time. And I would say, okay, this first one is a yes. The next one is a yes, the one with the lilies. The next one with those colors and rectangles and stuff, that's a no. And I would keep on going through like this and say which are a yes and which are a no. And then I would give students some new examples of paintings that I haven't shown them yet. And I would have them categorize that. Oh, based on all the ones that the teacher said were a yes, I think this painting is also in the yes category, or category A. Any guesses, by the way, what the yes category or category A is here with these paintings?
Impression.
And Sue, yes, it is likely that I would do those quick pop-up explanations in English because they're so short and I want to be clear. And yeah, excellent. Tons of you got it right here. If I'm trying to teach Impressionism, I could have started off with a lecture on like the reasons why Impressionism came about and what are the key features of Impressionism and so on. But I think this is kind of cool. Actually, you show a ton of examples and then students kind of start getting a feel for it. Then they get to categorize some of their own. And then this is really cool. And this would be with a painting example or the language example. You have students, once they have a bunch of examples in each category, like in the yes category or in the no category, you have students come up with a title for that column, a title for that category themselves, because then it's going to be a thing that makes sense to them as opposed to whatever the original grammar speak is. And then you can still say, I love that title you all came up with. If you want to think of it that way, great. Or maybe here's why that might not end up working down the road, but for now, Love that you thought of that. And then you can still say what linguists call this category is the imperfect subjunctive, or whatever it may be. I'll give you some language examples in a moment. Let me show you again all the steps here. So you can do it as slides or as kind of a chart. You show items with words or phrases that are a yes. In other words, they do illustrate whatever grammar feature you're talking about, and then you tell them which ones are a no, but you don't explain it. Then students, based on what they observe there, they try to come up with some examples of their own into each category, and then you kind of confirm if they're right or not. Then students, either as a group or in pairs or small groups, they try and detect, well, what's the difference between these two categories, or what do all the yeses have in common? Then you confirm that for them once they're right, or you kind of take them in the right direction. And then you have them come up with how they would summarize or how they would title that. And this has been done, teachers have done this. This is the same video reference or the same blog post reference. Teachers have done this with all different types of categories, like masculine versus feminine versus neuter adjectives, or different tenses of verbs, like passé composé versus imparfait, or pretérito versus imperfecto, or subjunctive versus indicative, although I especially like doing specific uses. So for example, have all the subjunctives be a negative command, for example, in a certain lesson, and so on. So I know this is a little bit abstract, but when you get these slides, go to that link that that's written there. I think I have it repeated here. I don't, but it's in the previous slides, and you can find a demo video of that done in World Language. I want to skip. I had kind of one more lens, one more metaphor that I thought about sharing, but I want to skip instead because we're at the end of time, not the end of all time, but we're out of time for this session. I'm going to show you really quickly some take-home points from this. So this is what if you have to, or you want to, or you choose to do a much more explicit version of teaching grammar than I've done here. I have a couple recommendations for that. Number one, think about time, sort of like I was when I started this session at 2:04 instead of 2 o'clock, and I'm therefore thinking about it again now. So think about time. And like I was saying at the beginning, what are good uses of time? Remember, given that there's a weak interface, not a strong interface between explicit grammar knowledge and linguistic competence, most of the time when we're teaching grammar explicitly, it's actually a time out from students getting better at the language. It's a really interesting thing to think about. They might be developing more knowledge about the language, but it's a time out from our limited time of developing in proficiency. I recommend that you teach meaning first. So even if you have to or want to teach the charts, teach many or most of those forms in the context of communication or stories first, and then say, hey, class, some linguistic scientists came and they took all these forms and they put them in a chart so that people can look them up if they want to, and here's what that looks like. So that in that order, because you can still teach that system afterwards, like I said. I recommend being honest with students. We can help ourselves and students a lot if we tell them that, hey, this time when we're talking about grammar explicitly, we're doing it kind of for its own sake or to kind of satisfy our curiosity. It's not expected, as in hardly any linguist on the planet expects that this discussion of grammar that we're doing will make you better at Spanish. But this is a language class, and we learn about different aspects of language. We get better at using it, but sometimes we also get better at talking about it, thinking about it, discussing it, and that's what we're doing when we do the explicit grammar information. Related, be honest with grades. No test on explicit grammar is testing a student's proficiency in using the language. So make sure that if you are supposed to report grades in terms of proficiency in communication, that those grammar scores aren't clouding that grade. That's for the sake of honesty and how we report student progress. And last but not least, cut yourself some slack. If you find, man, I'm teaching my heart out, I'm teaching the charts, I'm teaching everything so hard, but students don't seem to be getting better at Spanish, you can cut yourself a lot of slack because linguists don't think that they should be getting better at Spanish based on that. It's a piece of information. Those are pieces of information that might be worth learning, again, for their own sake or to become more of a linguist, but it's a separate track, like it says in this first point, separate track than developing that proficiency. So I'll leave it at that. These are some planning and reflection questions to leave you with. I want to cede the floor to my colleagues who are next. I think, Susanna, I think that question is about how long would that process of sorting into columns and so on take from start to finish. It can be as short as 5 or 6 minutes or as long as 20 minutes, depending on how major the feature is, how into it students are. But you'll see a video if you go to the link that I said that kind of demonstrates it from start to finish and get a feel for that. I'll give you, in case you want to contact me about any of that stuff. Oh, you can find similar information, not the same, but similar information once again in the hub to some of the things I've shared here, including some additional ways to teach grammar via Voces. And last but not least, if you want to get in touch with me about any of these things, feel free to holler at me at justinsb@vocesdigital.com. As you can tell, I enjoy nerding out about these things, and I enjoy kind of refining my practice based on what I hear from folks. And I'm happy to continue sharing more ideas like that. So thanks all for your attentiveness and for your contributions in the chat on such a deep and intense, but also fun in its own way topic. I'm going to be enjoying listening in along with the rest of you to the next presentation, and I'll also get to share some more ideas with you tomorrow. So thanks again, and until next time.